So today I get to introduce my big brother and his wife, Lisa. Lisa's here, just wave. And yeah. So I've known my brother all my life. We worked together in a church in Winnipeg. I was his associate pastor. He was the lead pastor. And we again worked in Blackaby Ministries. I was the international director for Blackaby Ministries, and he was the boss. He's a good boss. I enjoyed working with Richard, and he was always my go-to guy. He's the wise counselor that I needed in life situations. Very proud of all that he's accomplished and how God has taken him around the world to many places that most people don't get to go. And he's sat in the offices of presidents of countries and talked to CEOs of Fortune 500 companies around the world. He's a very well-respected author. Spiritual Leadership is one of his good books, as well as Updating Experience in God. He's done a lot of stuff in his life already. And so it's a privilege for me to give up the pulpit to Richard, to share you with him and to share him with you. And I hope we have a long relationship in the years to come as well. So Richard, would you bless us with what God has put on your heart to share with us? And thank you for being with us today.
Well, it is my delight to be with you. And, when Tom and Kim were praying about whether the Lord was leading them to come and minister here, I got to pray with them through that process. And so it's so good to see the other side and see all of your beautiful faces. And as Tom said, I do have the privilege of speaking in a lot of churches all over the world, all over the country. And when I go I've been in so many churches, I can just I get a feel of churches when I walk in the door. Can I just tell you, some churches I'm not sure there's a pulse or not. And then there's some churches I walk in, and your church, I'll tell you what a delight it was, just being in the lobby there in the foyer and hearing all the life and the joy and the fellowshipping. And you have a great vibe from this church as someone who's here for his first time. And I love that. I love that when God's people just enjoy being together and worshiping together. And so what a great just congregation you are. And so I'm just delighted. And I'm so excited for Tom and Kim to be here with you as well. As I said, I prayed with them as they were sensing God was leading them here. Can I tell you, I've been in, I think, every church they've ever ministered into. And everywhere I've ever been, people want to come and tell me how Tom and Kim were used of God to be a blessing to them. Everywhere they've been, things have been better. Things have been where God's been at work. And so I'm so excited for you because I know what's going to happen. I know it's already happening. But God uses them powerfully. And so I hope that you've had a chance just to get close to them and get to know them and let them minister into your life because it'll be awesome. Well, I want to talk to you this morning about something that the last time Lisa and I were in British Columbia was over Christmas. We actually arrived Christmas Day. And we were really excited about that because we actually have a son who's pastoring a church in Victoria. And he had 3 boys, but he was going to have his first girl, our 4th grandchild. And is there anything better than Christmas and a new grandchild? I submit to you there is not. This is about as good as it gets. And so we're going to have Christmas Day at our house in Atlanta, Georgia. I've got 2 other kids who live in Atlanta where we do. We're going to have Christmas with them. And then we're going to take a couple days and we're going to put the Christmas tree away and take care of all that stuff. And then, the end of December, we're going to fly up to Victoria, get in place for that granddaughter. That poor granddaughter has 3 barbarian older brothers. And so we were going to be there to help this poor little girl navigate her way into the world. And then on the 20th of December, 5 days before Christmas, we get a call from my son. And he has 3 boys, and the youngest boy, Finley, had turned 3 that very day. And on that day, he's going to have his birthday. He's turned 3. All of a sudden, he just starts to get very sick. And they finally have to take him to emergency on his 3rd birthday. And while he's in the waiting room trying to get registered, he goes into a 30-minute seizure. And they have to put him into intensive care. We got a picture. I can maybe show you that. That's Finley on his 3rd birthday last December. And the doctors there in the Victoria Hospital are trying to help him. They have him on a ventilator. He gets put into a coma. And the hospital in Victoria, just after 2 days, they said, we're afraid we can't do anything more for this child. If things get worse, we don't have the equipment here on the island to take care of him. So they fly him to the Vancouver Children's Hospital. His mother goes with him, Sarah. She's expecting a child any day. But now, instead of in Victoria, where they live, they're in Vancouver. She's staying in the hospital with her 3-year-old who's going to be over 2 weeks in a coma. Well, my son calls and says, Dad, can you get here a little sooner than when you plan to come? We need you here now. My son's saying, I may have to race to Vancouver. I've got 3 little boys here at the house. They need help. So Lisa and I change our plans. And we decide that we'll come out Christmas Day. Have any of you ever traveled on Christmas Day? Have you ever flown anywhere? I actually saved money changing my flight to Christmas Day. It was not that bad. So we had our Christmas with my other 2 kids on the day before Christmas. December 24th, we have a nice family dinner. We open presents, get all that taken care of. The next morning, Lisa and the cavalry is on the way. We are here to rescue and be there to help our grandkids. And we fly, we're going up on WestJet to Calgary. We're going to fly from Calgary over to Victoria. And I get a call from my son back in Atlanta. He says, Dad, I don't know how to tell you this, but we've all just tested positive for COVID. You can't go and be in contact with Mike. He's got a son in intensive care. He's got a wife who's about to deliver a baby. You can't expose him to COVID until you know if you have it or not. And so instead of racing there Christmas Day to have dinner with our 2 grandsons and son who are still there, we have to quarantine in a motel. And so we're in a motel. And we get there, and the next morning, I get a call from my daughter back in Atlanta. She's got a 3-year-old little girl, or almost 3 years old, and she ends up having a seizure, and she's raced by ambulance to a hospital in Atlanta. And we're in a motel, unable to help or do anything except just quarantine. And all of a sudden, have you ever been in a place in your life where you didn't want the phone to ring again? Because it just seemed like every phone call, it just got worse. Now, it's a much longer story. I won't take time to tell you all the rest of the story. But my wife is here, and she gets very mad at me if I forget to tell how it turned out. Because I usually move on, and then I get a dozen people saying, well, did they do okay? Are they still in a coma? I forget, detail. So, yeah, she did. They all eventually got out. It's a longer story. They had a huge snowstorm there in Victoria. We got flights canceled for 2 days. Tom and Kim actually came to the rescue in the Vancouver hospital and sent all kinds of Kim's amazing baking and food, and family was awesome in that time. But and I tell you that the kids turned out fine. We're going to see little Finley Wednesday, and the last time I saw him, we were just bringing him home from a hospital, and so we're excited. But I don't say that for you to feel sorry for me, because I know there's people in this room who've had far worse experiences than that. That we got off easy, really, with that. Everybody turned out all right. But what I want to talk to you about for the next few moments is what I call Jesus in the storm. Because that was a storm for us. We're going into Christmas with a new grandchild. We're thinking, does life get any better than this? And then the phone calls start coming. And it doesn't take very many phone calls for a really joyful life to start going south, does it? Just one call from the doctor's office saying, we found something on the last test we'd like you to come and talk to us about. Or just a call from the boss, a call from one of your kids, and all of a sudden what was looking like a great day becomes filled with dark storm clouds. And so I want to talk to you about Jesus in the storm. And there's a wonderful passage in Mark chapter 4 that I want us just to look at for the next few moments here. And I'll tell you what, whenever I face a difficult time in my life, I just find that if I go to the Word of God, there's always something to speak to what I'm going through. And this is a passage that has just ministered to me so much. Over the last 2 years, I think every one of us, since 2020, we've all been sailing through a storm of some kind, have we not? There's been storms battering the economy, our health, our families, our friends or churches. And I want you just to look at an experience when Jesus went through a storm with his disciples and why it's so important that when you do go through a storm, that you go through with Jesus. And so in beginning of verse 35, it says, on that day when evening had come, he told them, let's cross over to the other side of the sea. So they left the crowd and took him along since he was in the boat, and the other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking over the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. He was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. So they woke him up and said to him, Teacher, don't you care that we're going to die? He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, Silence, be still. The wind ceased, and there was a great calm. Then he said to them, Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith? And they were terrified and asked one another, Who then is this? Even the wind and the sea obey him. I want you just to look for a moment at an interesting passage to me. It begins in verse 35, and it says, on that day. And of course, if you start a passage and it says on that day, what question do you need to ask? On what day? What happened that day? And if you go back to the beginning of that chapter, you see Jesus is teaching, and he's teaching the multitudes. He's by the Sea of Galilee. He gets on a boat, probably Peter's boat, and they have to actually push off a little bit into the water just because the crowds are pressing upon them so fiercely. There's so many people, and he teaches all day. And Jesus teaches some amazing things. He teaches the parable of the sower and about the mustard seed, some of his great parables. He's teaching there, and then at the end so that's what he's done all day long. Now it's getting to be evening. And the disciples are thinking it's time to go find a restaurant somewhere and relax a little bit. We've been listening to Jesus preach all day long, and instead Jesus says, hey, let's push off and go sail to the other side of the sea. You know what I've discovered with Jesus is that when he was discipling people, he did three things. First, he'd always teach people, which is what we seem to do pretty well in our churches. We have Bible studies, we have services like this. There's a lot of opportunities to learn from God's Word. But the second thing Jesus would always do, at a certain point after he taught for a while, he would say, all right, let's go practice what you've just been taught. We don't do that as well in church. We come back every Sunday learning more information in our heads that we don't have in our life yet. And so then we just keep coming back and filling our heads with knowledge. Jesus didn't do it that way. He'd put a little bit in their head, and then now he'd say, now, let's go practice this so it gets into your life. And then a third thing he would do is the disciples would come back and they would process what happened. And Jesus would say, well, how'd it go? What did you learn? What would you do differently? And so here Jesus is taught all day, and now when the disciples think they're done for the day, he says, no, let's go practice some of this. And so they get sailing off into the night. And it's interesting, by the way, it says it's when evening came. Isn't it interesting? This is actually, by the way, a really interesting way of writing here. It's kind of like Mark is saying it was on a dark and stormy night because the storm's coming, it's getting dark. Have you ever noticed that life just seems scarier in the dark? Why is that? Right? It's nothing's really changed except you can't see, right? But like if you're in your house at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and you hear a creak on the floor, what do you think? Oh, I wonder if someone's home. Maybe the hardwood floor is creaking. Maybe the humidity is changing out there. But if you hear that same loud creak at 2 o'clock in the morning, what do you think? Like it's the very same creak, right? But when it's dark out, those creaks sound a lot scarier than in the middle of the day, right? So it's the nighttime. Can I tell you, one thing that Tom and our dad taught us was that nighttime will come for all of us. And when the night comes, you need to hold on tightly to what God taught you in the day. When you come here to church, it's daytime. It's easy to believe God's all-powerful when you're in a church on a Sunday morning. But when you're in a doctor's office on Monday evening, when you're getting a call in the evening from a distraught friend or family member, that's a different story. And when you're learning truths here, you might be thinking, well, I'm not sure I even need this truth right now. Everything's going great in my life. Well, let me assure you, nighttime is coming. And there will be a moment where you're going to need what you learned in the day. And so evening comes. And it says that they left the crowd, they took Jesus, and there's an interesting phrase here. It says, and other boats were with him. Now, the New King James says there were other little boats. Other little boats. And that's the kind of thing. It's interesting to me because those little boats don't ever get mentioned again. I'm not sure if they all sunk in the storm or what happens, but there's these little boats sailing with them. And I love that little phrase because what that tells me is if Jesus is in the boat with Peter, and Peter, probably Andrew, James, and John perhaps were in their boat, there's other disciples that don't get mentioned. We know that there were women who followed Jesus and traveled with him. We know there were other sort of fringe followers who followed as well. The Gospels tend to just focus on the people we need to know about. But aren't you glad to know that there were always other followers of Jesus whose name didn't get put in the Gospels? But they were there, and they played an important role. And so, of course, James and John had a boat. There obviously were other boats. And you think to yourself, why does Mark even mention the fact that there's other boats sailing with Jesus? Like, what difference does it make? All you really care about is that Jesus is in a boat, right? And so, but when I read something like that in the Bible, sometimes I just stop and I think to myself, well, do I have little boats in my life? Are there little boats in my world as well? Am I sailing alone in this life, or are there other little boats with me? And as I began to ask, well, what are my little boats? God reminded me of my 3 kids. My kids are all little boats who've been sailing along their life with me. And these are my 3 kids. That's a couple years ago, but Mike on the left is the one that's pastoring in British Columbia and in Victoria. And my daughter Carrie, my son Daniel, they both work for us. They live in Atlanta. They both work for our ministry. My daughter's husband Sam works for the ministry as well. So it's called Blackaby Ministries. So we got lots of Blackabys working there. Tom used to work for us. And they work for me. And so in 2020, things are rolling along. Things are great. The ministry's going well. And then all of a sudden, COVID hits. And I speak for a living. I travel around and speak. And all of a sudden, every meeting is being canceled. You know what that was like. Church services are shutting down. I had over 90 different meetings canceled that I was supposed to speak in. And normally, when I speak somewhere, I'll be paid an honorarium, and we'll give that money to our ministry, and we'll use that to pay my kids so that they can, my grandchildren, have something to eat. And so all of a sudden, I'm just getting cancel. And all the revenue to our ministry is just drying up. There's no money coming into our ministry. Now, I've told all 3 of those kids their whole life that you can trust God, that God is awesome, and that no problem can ever face your life that God is not more than capable of taking care of. But all of a sudden, I've got to pay these kids. And I'm not sure how many months we can go with no money coming in until I can't pay their salaries anymore. But I don't want my kids to see me worrying because I've told them that they can trust God. I don't want my kids saying, you always said we could trust God, Dad. Why are you a worried wreck? Why are you so nervous? Why are you fretting? But God just reminded me, I've got little boats sailing along my life, watching how I handle the storm. And if they see me panicking in the storm, they're going to think they need to panic too. They're going to wonder if God is as awesome as I say he is if I worry the first time a storm comes up. And so I just began, and I'm thinking to myself, if we keep losing money, we may have to start laying off staff. And I've never faced this issue before. Do you lay off your son before you lay off your daughter? What is the etiquette of that? I assumed I'd jettison my son-in-law first. He's overboard, but once it got down to flesh and blood, and I couldn't imagine telling my daughter she was fired. So, I'd have to fire myself before I had the nerve to do that. So I've got really awkward decisions to make. And right when things are getting really tense and there's no, this is kind of early on in May or so of 2020, everything's shutting down, but we don't know how things are going to work out, what government might do or anything like that. My son-in-law emails me and he says, Richard, hey, I just want you to know we got a letter from a guy, a CEO that you work with, and he has a check for $10,000 in it. Now, he designated that money, so we can't actually use it to pay salaries. Like, it was actually not, we couldn't really use that money much, but I hadn't heard from this man in probably 3 years. Just out of the blue, sent $10,000. And so I emailed the man. I said, hey, just want to thank you. I said, I'll tell you what, things are really tough right now, and I'm just so moved that you would think of us in this time and you'd send a gift like that, and so thank you for that $10,000. And about 10 minutes later, I get an email back from the man. He says, $10,000? He said, I didn't tell them to send you $10,000. And my first thought was, why was I grateful? Why did I say thank you? I should have never said thank you. We'd still have the money. And then I kept reading. He said, I told them to send you $100,000. And, well, that's what I said. and so he copied whoever it was who was supposed to send that check. And so a few minutes later, she replies back to both of us, and she says, well, remember, you said send $10,000 to that designated fund, and you said to send $100,000 to the general operating. She said, we cut that check today. They should have it by the end of the week. I'll tell you what. You know what? You know the first thing I did is I went to all those little boats, and I said, you remember how I told you could trust God? Let me tell you what he did today. You can trust him. He is faithful. You see, what I discovered about the storms of life is that just because you're a Christian doesn't mean you get exempted from storms, right? Because that confuses us, doesn't it? We're a Christian, we're trying to do what God tells us, and then a storm strikes. Well, I thought God loved me. Well, Jesus never says you're immune, you somehow get a pass from storms. But what he does say is that he will be in the boat with you when you face the storm. And his presence makes all the difference. By the way, do you know the only reason why these disciples are going to be in a storm on that night? It's going to be because they did what Jesus told them to do. The only reason they're out in the middle of the Sea of Galilee is because Jesus told them to go there. And that's one of the most confusing things about the Christian life, isn't it? Have you ever felt God told you to go to work at a job? And then when you got there, you found out the boss was like, an escaped Nazi criminal and you realized, well, wait a minute, God, I thought I was supposed to be here. Or maybe, God told you should support some mission project, and then all of a sudden your transmission went out, and you have this unexpected expense. It's like, well, God, why is it that when I obeyed you, then things got worse? They're supposed to get better, right? But the disciples did what Jesus said. They got in a boat and set out to sail, and then they ran straight into a storm. By the way, do you think Jesus knew that storm was coming? See, some people think, well, Jesus was human, right? He surrendered his divinity, so maybe he just didn't know. Maybe he thought it would be a nice evening cruise across the sea, and he was as surprised as anybody else. I think he knew. And if he didn't know from himself, he knew because he and the Holy Spirit were quite close, and the Spirit seemed to always let him know what he needed to know. I think he knew full well, if you do what I told you to do, you're going to sail smack dab into a storm. Would you trust Jesus enough to sail into a storm if he was in the boat with you? He knows what's coming. And so they set into the storm at night, and it says he was in the stern. Now, notice what it says. It says a great windstorm arose, and the waves are breaking over the boat so that the boat is being swamped, and he was in the stern sleeping. Now, if these disciples are so scared of the storm that they think they're going to die, and the waves are washing right over the top of the boat. So, Jesus has got to be soaking wet, right? He's lying down in the boat, water, the waves are coming over. These disciples are screaming and yelling and hollering, and how on earth is Jesus still sleeping? Have you ever thought of that? There's only two reasons I can think. One is that tells you how tired he was. Like, he had to be really tired, right? Are you comforted by the fact that Jesus got tired doing God's will? For years, Lisa and I would volunteer at our church doing nursery about a couple months. We'd watch the 4-year-olds. They were almost all boys. I think we had like 14 4-year-old boys one time. And I'll tell you what, I was not too proud to say, I'm having a nap this afternoon. Like I may not even have time to eat before I'm having that nap, but that nap's coming. Have you ever worked so hard for God and then you were just bone tired? Even Jesus did that. You know what? Don't feel bad if you're worn out for Jesus. Jesus was worn out for Jesus sometimes. He sleep. But you know what else? I think Jesus was absolutely confident who held him in his hand. He knew he wasn't going to drown in the Sea of Galilee. He knew that his Father had this, and so he could sleep like a baby. During COVID, I asked a number of people, how have you been sleeping lately? How have you been sleeping? If you've been nervous and anxious and worried, you might have forgotten who's in the boat with you. Doesn't mean that there's not problems, right? But it just means if Jesus is in the boat, you can sleep because the Prince of Peace is there with you. And so notice what the disciples do here. They came to him, they woke him up. They said, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to die?" By the way, do you realize in that one sentence they've said at least 3 things that are wrong, that are not correct? What have they said? They start out by calling him a teacher, right? Now, that's half right. He is their rabbi. He is their teacher. But he's a lot more than a teacher, isn't he? He's the Lord of the universe. You see, during COVID, I think we saw some Christians who looked to Jesus as a teacher. Great moral teaching, great principles to live by. But as soon as the storm struck, they were scared to death. Now, I've had some good teachers in my life. I grew up in Saskatoon, in Saskatchewan. My 6th grade teacher, my grade 6 teacher, was an awesome lady, Mrs. Epp, godly woman, best teacher I would have for years after that. I didn't realize I was going to have lean years right after that year, but grade 6 was awesome. But can I tell you something? If I was on a boat that was sinking, having Mrs. Epp on the boat with me would not comfort me in the slightest. Like, I would not have any confidence going under because Mrs. Epp was going under with me, right? Like, teachers are good for what they do, right? But if you're in a storm, teachers aren't all that helpful. You need the Lord of the universe, right? See, that's the problem. They're going to discover they've been looking to Jesus like a teacher, not as God. Folks, he's God. If you go through a storm in life, you don't just have a good teacher walking with you. You've got God going with you. And that makes all the difference in the world. But then you notice what they said. He said, "Don't you care? Don't you care?" And of course, isn't that interesting? Before the storm, of course they thought Jesus cared, right? What happened? Just one storm comes along, all of a sudden they're questioning the love of God. Folks, is that all it takes for you to question the love God has for you? Go through a storm and now God doesn't love me anymore? Storms kind of help expose what we think about the love of God, doesn't it? And, my dad, years ago, Tom and we have a little sister. She had 4 barbarian older brothers. And when she was 16, she came down with cancer. And the doctors had misdiagnosed it, let it go way too long. It's quite advanced. The doctors said we're going to have to do extensive chemotherapy, radiation, just throw the kitchen sink at her, hope that we can stem the tide. And they went to my dad and they said, people came to my dad, they said, "Well, what do you think about the love of God? Here you are serving God, you're ministering, and God's letting your 16-year-old daughter have to fight for her life with cancer? What kind of loving God would do that?" And our dad had said, "You know what, I'm not going to decide about God's love based on this. Years ago, I went to the cross and I saw my Savior bleeding to death for me. I settled it then. If Jesus would do that for me, I'll never question his love again. Now, I may not understand why a loving God is letting me go through some things, but that he loves me, I'll never doubt again." And folks, you need to settle God's love in your life long before you enter the next storm. You need to have that in place before the storm strikes, not in the middle. And then lastly, do you notice they just said, "Don't you care? We're going to die." Of course, they weren't going to die, right? But these disciples had watched a panel of experts on TV, and they had all assured them that if you face a storm like that, you're going to die, right? Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't watch the news. I'm not saying you shouldn't be informed, but can I just tell you this? The experts in our world don't know as much as God does. And so be informed, study, find people you trust to tell you the news, but then go before the Word of God and say, "God, what do you have to say? Here's what I've learned from the world. God, what do you have to say? How do they fit together?" I was speaking in a conference, and this couple came up to me, and they were really worried, really anxious. They exuded anxiety. And I said, what's going on? And they were just so concerned about so many things. And finally, I said, listen, I said, can you help me out here? I said, on an average day, how many hours a day would you say you're watching 24-hour news? And they said, well, we turn it on when we get up in the morning. It's on through breakfast. It's on till we leave for work. As soon as we get home, we turn it back on. We don't sit in front of it the whole time, but while we're making dinner and having dinner, and really until we turn out the lights to go to sleep, the news is on. So they said, I guess about 8 hours a day. I said, wow, that's a lot of TV. I said, so, by the way, how many hours a day are you reading this right here? And they kind of looked kind of sheepish and said, well, I guess about 15 minutes. We have a quiet time each morning, about 15 minutes. So I said, so you're letting the world have 8 hours a day to tell you what it thinks, and you're giving God 15 minutes. I said, now I'm not telling you not to watch the news. I'm just telling you, give God equal time. Let God tell you his opinion. And I said, I'll promise you this. I said, I'm a doctor. Now, I'm not a doctor that can do anything worthwhile, but I do have a doctor's degree. And if I could prescribe for you, dramatically watch less news on TV and dramatically increase how much of God's word you're taking into your soul, I promise you your anxiety level will go down. It doesn't take away all your problems, but it will help you know that the Prince of Peace is in the boat with you, and it will be all right. And so just notice, as we close here, Jesus, it says in verse 39, he got up. By the way, why do you think Jesus gets up? Now, have you ever stood up in a canoe? Is that a good thing to do? No. And this boat is rocking, and the waves are pouring over it. Like, why is Jesus standing up? And couldn't he just calm a storm from a lying down position? Does he have any more power or authority when he stands up than when he lies down? I don't think so. I think he could lie down and have just as much power. So why does he stand up? Well, I think it's because he wanted those other little boats to see him. The people in his boat could see what he was doing if he's lying down or standing up, but the little boats can't see him. He's lying down. They can't see him above the edge of the boat. But when he stands up, what do you think those other little boats are thinking? Hey, look over there. Jesus, he's standing up. I wonder what he's going to do. And all of a sudden, every eye is on Jesus. What's he going to do? You know, I've thought sometimes, I wonder during the last 2 years if Jesus wanted to stand up in some of our churches and say, hey, everyone, just look at me. Turn your attention to me. I know you're troubled. I know you're anxious, but look at me. And if you'll keep your eyes on me, you'll see miracles take place. And then Jesus rebukes the storm. There's a great calm, it says. Now, have you ever been, when you're by the water, of course, even when the winds stop blowing, the waves can be agitated for some time, right? The waves are coming in. You know there's been a storm out to sea. But this wording indicates that when Jesus brings calm, there's not a ripple left in the water. When he brings calm, there's no ripples left. There's absolute calm. Do any of you need Jesus to speak calm into your world this morning? You see, Jesus sometimes calms the storms around us. Sometimes Jesus calms the storms in us. And sometimes Jesus will look at you and he can speak that same calm into your life. And then just notice what he says. He says, why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith? What is he combining there? He's saying you can't have faith and fear at the same time. If you're filled with fear, don't think that you have faith. Faith drives out fear, and fear will drive out faith. You can only have one. And so Jesus, he draws a straight line and says, why are you so afraid? If you're that fearful, you can't have the faith you ought to have. And so then notice the last verse. It says, and they were terrified and asked one another, who then is this? Even the wind and the sea obey him. By the way, there's two words for fear that are used here. The first one is they're afraid of the storm. The second one is they are terrified of Jesus. Do you know what this says? This says they thought they were facing something fearful when they saw the storm. They thought they were encountering something awesome in the storm. But then they realized there was someone far more awesome in the boat with them. He was far greater than any storm they could ever face. and they realize he's the one that's awesome, not this storm. And then the story ends. And I want to just encourage you in a moment. I'm just going to pray for you. But can I just encourage you? I suspect that some of you have been through quite a storm in the last year or two. And you've gone through things perhaps you never dreamed you would face. And perhaps you weren't prepared for it. Can I encourage you? The Prince of Peace is in the boat with you. But it's easy to get your eyes on the wind and the waves and off of Jesus. And sometimes we just need to say, Jesus, I'm so sorry. I began watching those waves. They were getting so big, and the wind was blowing so fiercely, I forgot to look over at the boat and get my eyes on you. But when I get my eyes on you, I'm sorry, Jesus, you had to stand up and get my attention to realize it's about you. But also, I just needed to be regularly reminded that there are other little boats sailing alongside me. And really, I can tell my kids all their life that they serve a powerful God, but watching their dad go through one storm can tell them more about how powerful my God is than all the Bible studies that we have in our home. And my kids were all watching me to say, I guess we're going to find out how awesome God really is. Let's keep our eyes on our parents and see how they handled the storm. You know what? You can't go back and go through COVID again. None of us want to. But if you're like me, there's times I wish I could hit rewind and try going through a crisis and do it better the next time. Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever felt like, I don't think I handled that very well. I wish I could have that as a do-over. I'd be so much more of a confident Christian than I was the last time. Unfortunately, you can't do that. But by the way, we'll face another storm. You'll have another opportunity. Maybe you just need to go to the Lord and say, God, there's little ships sailing along my life. I pray that all of our kids, when they see the way we handle the storm, when you get to the end of the storm, just like these disciples, you have a higher view of Jesus than you had before the storm. I pray your walk with God's deeper than it was before the storm. That's why God lets us go through them, so that we see some things about him we never saw before. So I'm going to just pray with you and just ask the Lord, at whatever stage you're in, you might be about to enter a storm you don't even know about yet, but you're one phone call away. Or maybe you're in the storm, and right now you just say, I'm just holding on, trying not to sink. But I know I just need to turn my gaze back to the Prince of Peace there in the boat. Or maybe you're on the other side and you just have to say, God, thank you for taking me through the storm. You are good. You're faithful, just like you said you would be. And so let me pray with you, and I'll be done. Lord, thank you for these wonderful people, this wonderful church. But Lord, you have people all over the world who've been sailing through storms in recent years. It seems that that's just part of life. At times you steer us into a storm. You know they're coming, and you lead us in that direction anyway, because you know you'll go through them with us. You're in the boat with us. And so, God, would you help us if some of us perhaps have taken our eyes off of you? The waves, the wind have seemed so fearful. God, would you help us just to get our eyes back onto you and to see just how awesome you are. You're far greater than any storm we could ever face. And may we just embrace the Prince of Peace even this morning and let you bring a great calm into our hearts, into our minds, into our thoughts, into our emotions. God, we need that peace that only you can give. And so, God, here in this moment, in the daytime, help us to have the truth that you know that we'll need before the next storm comes in the night. Prepare us, get us ready, so that we can honor you and glorify you by the way we handle the storms in our life as well. And I'd pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.